I discover that my brother-in-law is not human because something strange wants to take him away, and my sister gets angry calling me a liar. Since my sister Clara married Adrian, something in our family stopped working well. I couldn't pinpoint it with certainty at first, but it was a feeling, a constant uneasiness that became impossible to ignore. Clara used to be spontaneous, talkative, with that vibrant energy that filled any room she entered. But over the months, his laughter became less frequent and his gaze more tired. At first, I thought it was because of Gabriel, my 7-year-old nephew. All young parents go through sleepless nights, stress, and exhaustion. But the more I saw it, the more I noticed that it wasn't just tiredness. It was something deeper, as if something was consuming her little by little. The worst came when Gabriel started getting sick. The boy had always been healthy, one of those who run nonstop and end up covered in bruises from playing too much.
If you like this video, stay until the end, like, subscribe, and activate the bell for more videos.
But one day he stopped running, then he stopped playing, and then he was no longer the same. First, it started with a fever. Nothing serious, I thought, but the fever came and went without explanation. Then he began complaining of joint pains, as if his own body was betraying him. In less than a month, he lost weight alarmingly. His skin turned pale, almost ash, and doctors couldn't find a reason. They did blood tests, checked her diet, her medical history. Nothing. It's just a bad streak, Clara said when I insisted on taking her to another specialist. Children get sick, you know? But this is not normal, Clara, I replied. He's not just sick, he's declining. She looked away, as if afraid to say anything, as if she knew more than she was willing to admit. But the one who worried me the most was Adrian. From the beginning, I never quite liked him. He was a quiet man, one of those who look at you too much but say too little. When Gabriel began to get sick, his reaction was not one of anguish or worry, but of anger. He would get upset when I asked him about the doctors, about the treatment, about what they were doing to help his son, as if my interests were an offense. One night, I went to his house to visit Gabriel. When I arrived, Clara was not there. He had gone out to buy medicines. Adrian, on the other hand, was in the living room, sitting with the television off. I was just there, in the shadows, doing nothing. I'm going to see Gabriel, I said, uncomfortable with his presence. Don't wake him up, he replied without turning to look at me. I ignored his warning and went upstairs. Gabriel's room was completely silent. I opened the door slowly and saw his little figure on the bed. He breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. I sat down next to him and ran my hand over his forehead. It was freezing. Uncle, he murmured without opening his eyes. Here I am, champion, I whispered. Gabriel opened his eyelids just a little, and a shiver ran through my body. Her eyes, which had always been light brown like her mother's, had a strange shadow, a dark shade that did not belong to her. But what disturbed me most was what he said afterwards. Don't let me take me. I swallowed hard. Who, Gabriel? Dad. I felt the blood leave my face. Your dad what, Gabriel? But the boy had already fallen asleep. I stood there for a moment, my skin standing on end. What did he mean by that? Why was she so afraid of Adrian? When I went downstairs, Adrian was no longer in the room. The television was still off. The dim lights barely illuminated the space. Everything was silent. Then I heard it, a low, slurred murmur, almost like a lament. It came from the hallway. I turned slowly, and my heart stopped for a second. There was Adrian, standing in the dark, watching me with those dull eyes. I don't know how long it was there, but I felt the air get heavier. You shouldn't get involved in what you don't understand, he said in a low voice, but with a hardness that froze my skin. I just want to understand what's wrong with Gabriel, I replied, trying to control my fear. There's nothing to understand. He took a step toward me. And you better stop asking questions. We stared at each other in a silent confrontation. There was something about his expression, in the way his shadow stretched strangely on the wall, that made me feel that Adrian wasn't normal. When Clara arrived, he tried to talk to her again. Clara, please. Something is not right with Gabriel, I begged her when Adrian went out into the courtyard. She rubbed her face tiredly. I'm doing the best I can, okay? Just trust me. It's not you I don't trust. He looked at me with warning. Don't say things that might make this worse, he whispered. Start what? She opened her mouth to say something, but at that moment, Adrian returned. He looked at both of us and smiled slightly, as if he knew exactly what we were talking about. That night, I left with only one certainty. My brother-in-law was hiding something, and I was going to find out what it was. The feeling that something was wrong with Adrian did not leave me alone. Since that night at his house, where I found him standing in the dark staring at me expressionlessly, I couldn't get the image out of my head. Something about him wasn't normal, and my nephew knew it. Over the next few days, I tried to get closer to Gabriel, but every time I did, Adrian found an excuse to stay away. He's tired. Let him rest, he said coldly. Clara didn't help much either. Although I noticed his concern, every time he brought up the subject, he avoided answering me clearly. Please, just trust us, he repeated. But to trust how when he saw Gabriel slowly waste away? Then, something happened that made me confirm my suspicions. It was early in the morning when I received a message from Clara. Please come. Something is wrong with Gabriel. My heart raced. I grabbed my car keys and drove as fast as I could to his house. When I arrived, Clara greeted me with her eyes swollen from crying. I don't know what to do, he whispered. It's worse. I ran to Gabriel's room and found him in a deplorable state. Her skin was even paler than before, her lips dry and chapped. He was breathing heavily, and when I tried to talk to him, he could barely open his eyes. You have to take him to the hospital, I said to Clara. This is not normal. He needs urgent medical help. But before I could insist any further, Adrian appeared at the door. He's not going to any hospital, he said in a firm voice. I turned to face him. What the hell are you talking about? Look at your child. Adrian did not flinch. He stood there, watching me with a chilling calm. You don't understand, he whispered. Please make me understand. For the first time, Clara seemed to be on my side. Adrian, we have to take him to the doctor. This is already too much. He was silent for a moment, but then he looked at Clara with something I couldn't describe, something that made her lower her head and keep silent. That was the instant I knew it wasn't just Gabriel who was caught up in something. My sister was too. That night, I decided not to leave the house. I stayed in Gabriel's room, watching over his sleep. Clara had locked herself in her room, and Adrian, I had no idea where I was. Around 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a strange noise, a low murmur, as if someone were speaking in a very low voice. I sat up slowly and looked at the half-open door of the room. The hallway was dark, but there was something there, a shadow. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't Adrian. There was something else. My heart was pounding as I got up and walked cautiously toward the door. When I poked my head into the hallway, the shadow was gone. But what I did notice was the door to Adrian's room ajar. I took a deep breath and moved forward. The house was in a deathly silence, every step that seemed to resonate too loudly. I approached Adrian's door and pushed carefully. What I saw made my blood run cold. Adrian was standing in the middle of the room, but he wasn't alone. In front of him, there was a tall, thin figure, almost translucent, as if it were a living shadow. The figure muttered something in a language he didn't recognize. Adrian nodded slowly, as if receiving orders. And then, the figure turned towards me. He had no face, just 2 empty sockets where your eyes should be. My whole body was paralyzed. Adrian looked at me too. You shouldn't have come, he whispered. Before I could react, the shadow slipped towards me with inhuman speed. I felt an unbearable cold that envelopes my body. Somehow, I managed to back up and run out of the room, slamming the door shut. My breathing was erratic. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was no doubt. Adrian was not human, and I had to get Gabriel and Clara out of that house before it was too late. I ran to Gabriel's room and locked the door. My heart was pounding so hard I felt like I would explode in my chest. What he had just seen was not an illusion, nor a bad dream. Something was happening with Adrian. something that didn't belong in this world. I approached Gabriel, who was sleeping soundly. His skin was cold and his breathing was weak. I couldn't leave it here. I had to get him out of the house as soon as possible. I reached into my pocket for my phone and dialed Clara's number with trembling hands. The call rang several times before she answered in a sleepy voice. "What's wrong?" "Clara, listen to me well," I whispered. "You have to come to Gabriel's room. Now." "Why? What's wrong? Please just do it." There was a moment of silence before he hung up. I stood still, listening to every sound in the house. Everything was completely silent. Not even the wind was blowing outside. A few seconds later, I heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Clara slammed the door open and looked at me with a face full of confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, worried. I closed the door behind her and whispered to her. "I saw something in Adrian's room. Something that is not human." His face paled. "What did you say?" "I don't know what it is, but it's with him. It's a shadow, something that speaks to him. Adrian is not normal, Clara. You know that, right?" She looked down, her lips trembling. He whispered. "I can't explain it, but you're right." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you know?" Clara took a deep breath. "Since I married Adrian, strange things have happened. Gabriel started to get sick for no reason. The house feels heavy, as if there was something else here. Sometimes I wake up in the early morning and Adrian is not in bed. I find him standing in the dark, muttering things in a language I don't know." I was speechless. "Why did you never tell me this?" "Because I'm afraid." I stared at her. "Clara, we have to get Gabriel out of here. Now." She hesitated. "I can't leave Adrian." "Adrian is not your husband," he exclaimed. "Whatever it is, it's no longer human." At that moment, the door to the room slowly opened. Adrian was there, watching us. "Where do you think they're going?" he asked in a strange, distorted voice. His shadow stretched unnaturally down the hallway. Their eyes didn't reflect the light. They were two bottomless dark pits. Clara stuck to the wall, trembling. "Adrian, I told you not to get involved in this," he said, staring at me. The air in the room turned cold. Gabriel began to convulse in bed. I ran to him, trying to wake him up, but his body was shaking violently. "Dijolo en paz, Grighty." Adrian smiled. "He doesn't belong to you anymore." Suddenly, the shadow around him moved, spreading like dark tentacles toward Gabriel's bed. I didn't think twice. I took my nephew in my arms and shouted to Clara. "Right?" She was paralyzed for a second, but then she reacted and ran with me out of the room. Behind us, Adrian let out an inhuman scream. The lights in the house flickered violently. The shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own. We made it to the front door, but when I tried to open it, it didn't move. "No, open!" Scream, desperate. Adrian appeared at the end of the hallway, his figure distorted by the darkness around him. "They can't leave," he whispered. "He is mine." Clara was crying, clinging to my arm. "Please let us go." Adrian tilted his head, looking at us with something akin to amusement. "If you want to take it so badly, then show me that you deserve it." Before I could ask what that meant, the entire house went dark, and the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I felt like we were falling into the void, and then everything went black. The feeling of falling lasted only a few seconds, but when I opened my eyes, we were no longer at Clara's house. We found ourselves in a dark and cold place, a kind of formless space where black spread out in all directions. Gabriel was in my arms. His body was still trembling, and Clara was clinging to me in despair. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know," I replied, looking around. Then we see it. Adrian was there, but he was no longer him. Her figure had elongated in an unnatural way. Her skin had a grayish tone in her eyes. His eyes were two cesspools that devoured the little light that was in that place, always getting in where you shouldn't. His voice sounded distorted, as if many voices were speaking at the same time. "You don't understand what's at stake." I watched him furiously. "Gabriel is not yours." Adrian dreaming, or at least, his face took on a shape that looked like a smile. "Gabriel was never just an ordinary child," he whispered. "It's special. It has something I need." A shiver ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Clara sobbed. He has always been sick, but it is not a normal disease. No matter how many doctors we see, no one can explain what happened to him. Because its essence is different, Adrian continued. It does not belong entirely to this world. I am only claiming what corresponds to me. The darkness around her began to move, as if she were alive. Gabriel groaned weakly in my arms. I couldn't let him take it. "I won't let you touch him," I said firmly. Adrian bowed his head, amused. "And what will you do to prevent it?" The shadow around him expands suddenly, advancing towards us like a wave of darkness. Instinctively, I backed away, but there was nowhere to flee. Then I felt something in my hands. It was warm. I looked at Gabriel. His skin, which was once cold as ice, now emitted a slight glow. His body trembled, but in a different way. He was reacting. Adrian also noticed it. His expression changed. "No," he whispered. "It's not possible." The light emerging from Gabriel intensified, expanding like a halo around us. Adrian's shadows twisted, as if they were suffering. Then, Gabriel opened his eyes. "No, I don't belong to you," he whispered in a weak voice. And with those words, the light exploded. A wave of light spread in all directions, dispelling the darkness and fading Adrian's figure in an inhuman scream. Everything turned white. When I regained consciousness, we were back in the house. Gabriel was breathing normally in my arms. His skin had color again. Clara was next to me, crying silently. But Adrian had disappeared. There was no trace of him, as if he had never existed. Clara never spoke of him after that night. It was as if, in his mind, he had never been real. I didn't mention it again either. I was only left with one terrifying certainty. My brother-in-law was not human, and what took him, it's still out there. Here is a reflection on this story. We often believe that danger comes from outside, from the unknown, but the reality is that the greatest threats can be within our own home. Just like in this story, in everyone's life there are people close to us who hide their true nature, manipulating, deceiving, and hurting us without us noticing it until it's too late. Not everyone who claims to love us has good intentions, and sometimes the real enemy is the one we trust the most.